why is it introducing something is such a big challenge? I've seen this most students, they struggle with writing introductions. Body, yes, I can. Conclusion, yes, I'll cobble up something. Introductions. How to introduce, one of the biggest challenges in writing answers when it comes to UPSC GS-IV. And in this video, we'll be talking about how to introduce answers. And introductions do matter because that's the first impression. You know, the way you introduce, that actually sets the tone for the whole answer. And the most important thing is people miss out on this part, because introductions are the place where the examiner gets introduced to you, your writing style. It's like first impressions. And first impressions always matter. In fact, your first impression decides whether it will be lasting impression or last impression. That's why watch out what you write in your introductions. Writing introductions, let's simplify them. When we say introductions, what exactly does introductions mean? Introductions are the first few sentences or the first paragraph a student writes when he starts writing an answer. And these introductions or the first few sentences matter. Why? Because here's where the student outlines his perspective, what perspective the student is going to take in the answer. It outlines the tone, and it also outlines the understanding of the question, which matters. In fact, the most important part of introduction is the examiner gets to know you. The examiner gets to know the way you're going to use the words. The examiner gets to know your line of thought. What exactly will you be presenting in the next paragraph? So that's why introductions do matter. And that's why we always focus on writing sensible introductions. Write measured, sensible introductions. Writing introductions, seriously speaking, is a big challenge and it's a big art. And the reason why it's an art is because you have to mix two things. You have to mix content and creativity. And mixing both is not everybody's cup of tea. And this is something which never comes naturally. You have to learn. It comes with practice. Content is something fine. You read a textbook, you get the content. But creativity is something where you have to use your imagination. And introduction is a place where both mix very well. And introductions involve two big skill sets: conceptual understanding plus creative presentations. So when you're writing your introductions, you not only show your conceptual skill, you also have to show your creativity. And that's where the examiner gets introduced to your creative skills. Not only conceptual understanding, it's also about your creative skills. And just look at this. You have 13 questions in section A. You cannot keep repeating the same style of introduction for all the 13 questions. It becomes monotonous, it becomes boring. That's why you need to be a little creative. And usually what students do is they have only one set pattern of writing introductions. They'll pick up a key theme, they'll pick up a key word and start explaining it. Fine, this kind of key theme based introductions may work in one question, may work in two questions, may not work in all the 13 questions. This is where you have to be creative. And don't worry, I'll share ways to be creative here. And one of the ways to be creative is we can use quotations. Oh, you can start your introductions with eminent personalities. You can also use something called current events. You can refer to current events. The most easiest way to introduce and the most creative way to introduce is using quotations. And quotations is something we're all used to it. I'm sure all of you must have got exposed to thought for the day in school. Like, I'm sure we all must have seen honesty is the best policy, these kind of thoughts for the day that goes around in school. All these can be used creatively to introduce an answer. Now, when I say using quotations, we can use quotes of great leaders, we can use ideas of philosophers, we can use ideas or statements made by even sportsmen. They also make sense. And this way, when you use, say, a sportsman, an Olympian, or probably a contemporary leader, a business leader, oh, you can quote Jeff Bezos also for that matter, provided that quote is connected to the theme. And quotations are a great way to start. And only thing is you should be very careful of connecting the quote with that theme. For example, let's take 2014 question. In 2014, there was this wonderful question: what does ethics seeks to promote in human life? Why is it all the more important in public administration? This question comes from the topic in a syllabus called Essence of Ethics. And here the question focuses on relevance of ethics. And had I been in your place, I would have introduced this question using Albert Camus. And Albert Camus was a Nobel Prize winning writer and existentialist philosopher. And he very famously said, "A man without ethics is a wild beast loose upon this world." Now this quote of Camus captures the very essence of relevance of ethics. It's a perfect fit between the question and the introduction. So you could have gone that way. You could have used such philosophers. I'll take one more example. In the year 2013, there was this quotation of Mahatma Gandhi: "There is enough for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed." Now this quotation is a statement made by Gandhi where he's critiquing consumerist culture, where he's talking about minimalism. And I would have preferred to use Diogenes here. Diogenes is a Greek philosopher who spoke about this. He said he has the most who's most content with the least. Now this quotation of Diogenes captures the minimalism. So this is how you use quotations. Quotes of philosophers or great leaders or contemporary statesmen, all this can be used provided you're able to connect the theme with the quote. And let me give you a word of advice here. Quotations form great introductions for three areas. Any question on essence of ethics, you can use quotes. Any question on values, you can use quotes. Any questions on character qualities or virtues, you can use quotes. For example, if there's a question on integrity, which is a big foundational value in your syllabus, you can use a quotation as an introduction. So, small tip: essence, values, virtues. Quotations make great introductions. And to help matters, I know finding quotations are a big challenge. Yeah, seriously, it's a big challenge. And besides, it's not about finding quotations. You have to find quotations which are authentic. And that's where we come in. Follow us on ethics.101 and Instagram page. You will find lots of quotes. Fine, quotations are a great way to introduce. But you cannot overuse quotations. So one has to find a balance how many quotations to use. That's where the next element comes in. Along with quotations, some of the questions you can refer to historical figures. You can refer to great leaders. Because all these historical figures and great leaders are somebody whom you would have read in your history books. History books in school, or even when you prepare for civil service also, there's a whole paper on world history. There's a whole section on culture and modern Indian history. You can use them. And all these great leaders and personalities stood for some values. They stood for some great character qualities. So that's why you can refer to them also in your questions. You can refer to them also in your writing answers. You can refer to them in your introductions. And they make wonderful introductions because these people symbolize those values and virtues. Like, let's take 2014 question. Human beings should always be treated as ends in themselves and not merely means. Explain the meaning and significance of this statement, giving its implications in modern techno-economic society. This statement is an idea given by Kant. And this statement is an absolute Kantian ethics idea. To introduce, had I been in your place, to introduce this question or introduce an answer to this question, I would have preferred to use somebody like Abraham Lincoln. I would have preferred to use somebody like Kailash Satyarthi. Because this quotations or this question focuses on something called not using humans as means, because humans are end in themselves. And Abraham Lincoln was absolutely conscious of this fact. That's why Abraham Lincoln focused on abolishing slavery, because he never liked the idea of humans being used as means. It's the same thought that motivated Kailash Satyarthi to fight against child labor. So these two people make wonderful introduction for this question, because here the theme of the question is humans not as means but an end in themselves. So in such questions, there's nothing wrong in using these personalities. I'll give you one more example. A couple of years back, UPSC had this question: the weak cannot forgive. Forgiveness is an attribute of the strong. This was in 2015. This is a quotation from Mahatma Gandhi. And had I been in your place, I would have preferred to use Samuel Nelson Mandela. In fact, in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, he mentions a lot about forgiveness. So using personalities makes sense, because a lot of these great people, great personalities, they stood for these values. That is why, along with quotations, using personalities, historical figures, great leaders. Oh, you can use sportsmen also. You know, when you look at great sportsmen like, say, Michael Phelps, they all had this great quality of perseverance, great virtue of perseverance. So you can use them. And these are people whom you read in your newspapers. Now, I'll give you an advice here. Great personalities are wonderful to introduce questions on values. Say, for example, there's a question on compassion. They make perfect sense. Question on virtues. I remember in the beginning when I was talking about writing introductions, I mentioned two things. I mentioned about content and creativity. And when I spoke about creativity, what I had in mind was not about quotations and using references of great leaders. What I had in mind was, how do you use current events? You know, we all read newspapers, we all watch TV news, we are all exposed to events that's happening around us. Your creativity comes into picture when you're able to connect the questions theme with the event that's happening around us. And this is something, if you can do, the examiner will be mightily impressed. Why? Because you're able to connect the events around us and the question theme. Like, for example, there are some questions which actually will give you a hint that you can use current events as an introduction. For example, in 2013, there was this question. It is often said that politics and ethics do not go together. What is your opinion in this regard? Justify your answer with illustrations. This is a perfect question where you could have used a current event, an event of political corruption, an event where a public servant was involved deeply in corruption, an event which showed there's a big gap between politics and ethics. So there are some questions like this where you can allude to current events. For example, there's one more question in the year 2014. And this was a question which was about sexual violence in the country. We are witnessing increasing instances of sexual violence against women in the country. Despite existing legal provisions against it, the number of such incidences is on the rise. Suggest some innovative measures to tackle the menace. Now, this is again a question which is very current, topical. Almost every other day in newspapers or in TV news, we see some acts or the other on this. You could have used such events as introductions. Oh, forget the events. We can also use data points. When I say data, when you read newspapers, you come across data also, figures also. This was something, like for example, you can quote National Crime Records Bureau, statistics. You can use it as a source of introduction. And besides, there are some topics, like for example, in 2021, there was a complete question on refugees. Now that's very contemporary. And every year you have a question which alludes to a contemporary event. So you can use those events in newspapers or in TV news, what you read, or in magazines as a wonderful source of introduction. So besides quotations, besides the references to great leaders, you can also use current events as a big source of introduction. So show your creativity here. Okay, till now we have seen three ways of introducing. We have looked at something called using of quotations. We have looked at something called referring to leaders and historical personalities. We also looked at how to use current events. But besides this, the most conventional way of introducing is using the themes. Whenever we read a question, there's a theme mentioned. Students, what usually do is they pick up a theme and introduce it. Oh, that's a good idea to introduce. But you cannot use it all the time. And theme-based introductions or keyword-based introductions works very well in conceptual questions. For example, there was a question on emotional intelligence. In those kind of questions, you can use keyword-based introductions. But otherwise, be creative. Try to show a little bit of diversity in your introductions. That helps. I have an advice for all of you. The more diverse your introductions are, there's every possibility your script will be a little different from other scripts. You get that extra marks. Finally, some pro tips for you. Firstly, learn to balance quotations, reference to current events, and personalities. Don't overdo one part. Because what I've seen is students have a tendency to overdo one part, but balance it. There are 13 questions, balance it. And when I say exam management, that's about this only, balancing it. You know what? When you balance it properly, it not only give a kind of a proper perspective to the examiner, but also leaves a very great impression. Why it will leave a great impression is, let me give an example. For example, the very first two questions, you use quotations as introductions. Later, you mix it up with something called current events, or you refer to current event. Now the examiner's interest becomes little high. He'll look forward to reading the fourth question because he's waiting what is going to come next. So keep him engaged. And the best way to engage your examiner is introductions. So balance it so that you keep your examiner engaged. Second, you have only 150 words. You know something, one of the interesting aspects of this whole exam is you have a word limit, 150 words. So keep your introduction short. My advice, 25 words maximum, not more than that. And I'm sure 25 words you should be able to manage it. Follow us to learn more about GS-IV. Meanwhile, happy studying and see you soon.